what we're going to be going over today, we're going to spend a little bit of time on what we call the independent workforce, and I'll explain that in a second. We're going to cover their income, their demographics, some of the more interesting data about them, what's been going on with that sector. Think of them as sort of self-employed freelancers and others, and I'll come back to it. And we're going to talk a little bit about what their lives are like, what their challenges are, what their growth prospects are, and in the end, hopefully set up some information so that we can help later on figure out how Cameo members can help this group. In terms of ourselves, we're Emergent Research. I'm Steve King, this is Carolyn Oakles, we're the two partners. We are independent workers ourselves. You're looking at the entire firm. So we're also married, in case we make the mistake of saying something along those lines, so you know in advance. Every so often we're in a meeting and we do something when they don't know that we're married, and we get some really interesting looks. So now we always try to tell people in advance that we're actually married. Our firm focuses on the self-employed, the independent worker, and micro businesses. We're a research and consulting firm. As Claudia said, most of our clients are larger corporations that are interested in selling more stuff to these people. We also work with government agencies and foundations that are promoting the sector. And we've been at it about a decade. We are an independent company ourselves, just two people. We use a lot of third parties, we use contractors, we use partnerships. And so I like to say we don't just forecast and analyze this sector, we actually live it day to day. So that's who we are. I have to figure out how to push this so it won't work, so it goes the right way. So let me explain what we mean when we're talking about the independent workforce. The easiest way to think about this group is it's a large group of people with non-traditional jobs. They don't have the traditional, I go to work for a boss, work for a company. And we have a pretty broad definition of that. It's the self-employed people that you think of as freelancers, as contractors, as anybody that works through a temporary agency we include in our group. There's about 3 million of those right now in the United States that are working through temping firms. On-call arrangements, other arrangements that mean you don't have the traditional 9-to-5 job where you think you're going to be there for a long period of time potentially, and that type of relationship. We also include micro businesses in this group, which are firms with less than 5 employees. When we're looking at this, our biggest interest are the people who are doing this and contributing a significant amount of their household income. And so when we study this, we break them into two broad groups: those that are working more than 15 hours a week at this type of business, and those that are working less. And what you're going to hear today is a focus on those that are working more than 15 hours a week. And the reason we do that is that's the group that we think are really doing this as a living as opposed to augmenting household income or potentially doing it as a hobby. Yes, sir.
How do you identify who those folks are, like with EDD information and forecasts? I mean, it doesn't jump out to me as far as being able to separate those out and figure out how much is an independent workforce versus sort of a salaried or type of workforce.
That's correct. This is based on surveys that we do. Okay. And so we do a national survey. We're actually fielding, as we speak, our 3rd annual national survey, where we're out actually asking people very specific questions to try to identify them as part of this group. We've been doing this survey, this will be the 3rd year. We've been studying this segment for about 10 years. We had the same issues everybody else had. How do you work with this given the government data? And the government data is really excellent for what it was designed to do. Unfortunately, it wasn't designed to figure out who's doing independent work. It was designed to figure out other issues. And so it has limitations, and it's not the Bureau of Labor Statistics' fault. They do a great job with what they've been tasked to do. But as you said, we can't easily segment that data in a way where we really understand what's going on in this marketplace. And so we actually spent a lot of time working with the BLS, hoping that they would come out with some new surveys. And in the end, we gave up and realized we were going to have to do it on our own. And there is a proposal at the BLS to do a survey from their side that would actually look very much like the work we're doing. It's been tabled, though, and I don't imagine, given the budget circumstances, it'll make it back anytime soon. So this data is based on a nationally significant sample survey. We actually do two surveys. We do a broad survey of the nation as a whole to try to understand how many people are involved as independent workers. And then we do a second survey of people who are independent workers to do the more detailed profiles. And it's a pretty extensive survey methodology that we have, and statistically very sound. And so when we do that, and this is from 2012, we came up with about 17 million, the exact number was 16.95, 17 million people that fall into this category as independent workers. And that's a substantial amount of the workforce. You can think about the oil and gas industry is roughly 10 million people in America right now, maybe 10 and a half given what's going on with the fracking boom. But it's a substantially large, sorry. You're able to click that down? My little PC wasn't quite set up yet.
What percentage of the workforce is this now?
Well, 17 million, the private workforce in the United States right now is about 120 million, and the total workforce, private plus public, is about 140 million. So you're looking at between 10 and 20% of the entire workforce, and a higher percentage of the private workforce. So when you actually put this in the context of the small business sector of America, we've got about 29 million businesses defined as small business in the United States. There's about 6 million what's known as employer businesses. Those are businesses that have one or more employers. I've listed the 17 million down here as our independent workforce. There's about 22 million businesses that the government calls non-employers. And that's non-employer businesses are businesses where only one person's involved, the owner. Non-employer businesses are different than what we do in that it includes anybody who earns more than $1,000 in a single year, or if they're in construction, more than a single dollar. And so again, we're looking at people that are spending at least half of their time. So I hope they would earn more than $1,000 or $1 if they're spending half their time. In terms of the employer and that's also different from the self-employed, which there's about 14 million identified as self-employed according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so I hate to bring up all these different numbers, but the reality is the numbers really shift, and their differences are because of different definitions. But in the context of this, we're about 17 million of the independents and about 6.5 million of employer businesses. And it's most of those are micro businesses. The 3.6 million is less than 5 employees. And then you go, the Main Street businesses are what you think of as traditional, what most people think of as businesses at about 1.7 million. And then it gets, very few companies are larger. 100 to 500 employees, there's only a little over 100K. It's about 110,000 right now in the United States. Yes, ma'am.
On the Main Street business, is it just by a number of employees, or is it revenue, or? No,
we've identified that. For that purposes of that chart, we've done it by employees, which is the easiest thing to think of. Those businesses average between about 300,000 and 900,000 to up to about $1.5 million in revenue, although it does vary depending upon the type of business. But we tend to look at it in terms of employees. So in addition to those 17 million people that are independent workers, a large chunk of the United States population believes that they're going to be independent at some time fairly soon. This is actually, we asked the question, are you likely to become an independent worker, go out on your own over the next 2 to 3 years? And we've done it 2 years in a row, and we've come up with about 13 to 14% of the people who currently aren't independent workers say they're going to be. And that translates out to about 28 million people. When we ask them that, we also ask them, are you going to do this because it's your choice, or are you going to do this because you have no choice? You're going to lose your job, there's no alternative. About 50-odd%, a little over 53% say they're going to do it fully based on their choice. Now, when you ask questions like these, you tend to get very high positive answers. This is an aspirational question. Becoming an entrepreneur, going out on your own is considered very positive by the population these days. And so when we actually cut through and figure out how many of those people are likely to do this, we reduce it quite a bit. And we're saying by 2023, about 23 million Americans will be independent workers. And so we have to discount this quite a bit. We understand that we do. But when you look at what they're doing, about 1 in 5 of them have actually told us that they've made some sort of substantial move to start their business. They've either gotten a tax ID, they've gotten a bank account, or they've gotten a website. So it's actually a pretty high movement amongst this group to go out on their own. And our data was pretty consistent year over year. And making this even more interesting is there's another group called the Global Economic Monitor Group, and it's a multinational effort to look at entrepreneurship around the world, and the US version of it's run by Babson College. They did a study about 6 months after we finished this data. This data we collected about this time last year. They collected their data in the fall, and they actually came up, they asked, are you likely to start a small business or your own business within the next 3 years? And they got 12.5%, which if you actually look at our number was 13%. If you get under the hood, it was actually 12.8, and I've rounded to 13. And so a separate national survey has actually come up with basically the same numbers. So what we're seeing is a strong interest in the population in believing that they're going to go out on their own, mostly by choice, but also because they have a lot of them, another chunk will say it's my only option, or I'm becoming unemployed. One of the things we are seeing is the number of people who believe they're going to go out on their own due to unemployment has been falling as the economy has gotten better. No great surprise there, but it's good for us overall. So what's behind all this, and what are the trends driving this shift? And there's a lot of trends going on out there. A lot of trends out there driving the growth of the independent workforce. But really, the big ones are, there's a structural shift going on in employment. Companies want to hire more independent workers. They call them contingent workers. And when we talk to corporations about this, today they'll tell us about 26% of their employment, when you're talking about Fortune 500 companies in the United States, they consider, in the surveys of that, they think about 26% of their total employment is contingent workers. And their definition of contingent worker comes very close to our definition of independent worker. So the first step is employment's basically changing. And then we have a whole series of other things going on. I mean, jobs, frankly, are harder to find. They're not nearly as attractive as they used to be. When people go through the mental calculus, should I go out on my own or should I keep my traditional job? It's been really interesting for us studying this over the last decade. It used to be that people believed that the traditional job was safer, more secure, great benefits, less work, more money. And then over the years, we've just seen the pendulum start to shift. The security's been moved away because of layoffs and downsizing. Benefits have been cut, workloads have been increasing. And we actually have found in our surveys about 40% of our independent workers say that they feel they're more secure being independent than they would be if they had a traditional job. And when you actually interview the people and ask them, why do you feel that way? The reasons are pretty consistent. No capricious corporation that could outsource me to India, my job to India, shut down my division, have a boss that doesn't know what they're doing, just general economic downturn. They feel that being out on their own and controlling their own destiny, and in most cases having multiple clients or customers in some form, insulates them and provides more security. We've only been asking that question specifically for 2 years. It's gone up in the 2 years we've been asking it. Anecdotally, I can tell you from other questions we used to ask 10 years ago, that used to be about 15% of the people would tell us that, and we're up to 40, and I suspect that will continue to move north. So less attractive. Technology, of course, is making it cheaper and easier to be an independent worker. And then, of course, it's being more and more perceived as being cool. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, when we look at this data, one thing we think that may be driving this is the shift in demographics on both ends. One, younger, sort of following the path that you talked about, and also aging population moving into the sector. Do you find that correlation or something that's happening around age that's and the change in demographics that is sort of driving this.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit later, but absolutely. And the demographic shifts, you're seeing older people are looking for encore careers. They're looking for new positions they want to work. People that are reaching traditional retirement age. Surveys consistently, and our interviews consistently tell us those folks want to continue working. They just don't necessarily want to do what they were doing before, nor do they necessarily want to spend as much time. And so a lot of them are choosing independent careers. We're seeing the younger kids, Gen Y, the millennials, choosing it in a lot of cases because they have no other options. It's really hard to get a job. But the interesting thing is the mid-career people, the Generation X people, are also choosing this quite a bit now because they have the networks and the ability to do so. So we're seeing it across all generations, but without a doubt, the younger people less by choice, and the older people more by choice are choosing it. And then there's some social drivers, people looking for more work-life balance, looking for more work-life flexibility. We consistently hear in our interviews and our surveys, autonomy, control, flexibility are the reasons I go out on my own. And traditional work hasn't historically provided any of those. So a lot of social reasons, a lot of demographic reasons, but absolutely, you're absolutely right about the age group. So with that, let me turn it over to Carolyn to take us through some of the more data in detail.
I think I'll stand here so that
Okay.
you be my button hitter.
Sure.
I just want to say we love Cameo. And let me put that right out front. So give yourselves a hand because you're doing amazing work. And one of the things that we look for in working with Cameo is to get feedback on what you're doing in the field and what the problems and particular issues are that you see, because that always makes our research a lot richer. So any feedback that you provide is very, very welcome. So I'm going to take this to the next level here in looking at more the who are these independent workers. And I'm going to start by addressing 5 myths of independence. And the first one is that people resort to independent work because they don't have options. And we just find that is not true. That as you see in this particular graph here, employment choice has been very consistent, and we have 55%, over half, are choosing the independent work completely on their own accord. If we add in a combination of some other external factors along with choice, we come up to 85%, and this has been very stable over both years. We also find that people they really like it. I mean, they're following their passions, and they're driven by very personal motivations to move to the independent workforce. So this isn't just by necessity. People are tired, as Steve mentioned before. The grind of the corporate world has really affected people. Everyone sees less opportunity in the corporate world, and so they're looking at what can I do that gives me some passion, gives me some satisfaction, and what allows me to have a little bit more control over my life. So these things are driving all of the different age groups, and we'll see as we move forward, they take on different meanings to the different cohorts, and we'll break those out specifically for you.
And I was just going to add, the unable to find a permanent job, you can see it's only 6%. Other people are saying that. And if we took out Gen Y, the kids, that number would fall dramatically. It's really heavily concentrated in the younger generation. The kids just coming up. We've created an economy that's not good for people that are young and or inexperienced, unfortunately.
Is the Gen Y also saying all the other top things?
They are, and actually, if we
concentrated in those.
But before the recession, when the job market was much more positive, Gen Y was very, very focused on defining their own careers as they wanted them. And so very passion-driven, very social benefits-driven. And then the job market fell out, and they found that they didn't really have the skill set to just go off on their own without somebody helping them along. And so some of what we'll show here is that, experience, getting that skill set, experience and professional networks are really critical to independent work. And that's something that Cameo can help these independents work with to improve the level of success. Okay. Now we also see here that the satisfaction is very, very high, and this goes across the board for all of the different generations. But again, it is very it definitely is much higher for the people who choose it and who are successful at it. And so we get a sort of a sense of amplification that independence is a very, very wonderful experience for those who come to the workforce with the skills to make it successful. And so I think as a society, what we want to try and do is help people develop the skills that they need in order to be independent, because independence is one of the most viable paths for moving away from unemployment.
Yes, ma'am.
How does this relate, or how is it correlated to revenues of a business? Because I was thinking that some of our clients who are doing very well would fit into this, but those who are not, maybe would not.
Well, I think that probably you'd have to step back behind the revenue side and see, are they meeting the goals that they set out for, or are they not? And if they're meeting, they might not have big revenue goals. And if they're meeting the expectations that they had, then they're very happy with it. If they're not meeting them and they feel that they need to develop a better business plan, or that they need a better network, or something else is happening, then those are things that they're tangible targets for them to work on and improve. But if they don't have help doing that, then they might not feel this is a good path, and they might be looking for an alternative back into traditional employment.
Yeah, and one of the things we've found is that people define their own success, and it's often rarely revenue driven, their definitions of success. And one of the things that we find the external world, government agencies, other people that are studying this, they define success as revenues. And they keep saying, well, if it's not a $100,000 business, or it's not contributing to this, it's not successful. And our interviews are very clear on this. The people that are doing these businesses aren't trying to please government agencies and the rest of us. They're trying to please themselves. And so I do think success does go up with revenue, but it's not that direct correlation when you actually get under the hood. It's have I met my goals, and if I have, I'm successful and I'm satisfied.
Actually, that comes up quite a bit with our work with the SBA and with the National Women's Business Council when we're looking at women, because they are constantly saying that women are not as successful as men at small business ownership. And what we see is that there are a lot of different goals being set, and that women are not necessarily trying to grow, mega organizations. They are trying to grow an organization to the point where they can live well, and it gives them the lifestyle that they're looking for. So it might be a little bit more. It can be revenue generated in terms of being very comfortable economically, but there's a pretty strong role of lifestyle impact in there. And for men traditionally, there's been some of that. I want to have the big prize, or I want something to show society that I've done this. And we haven't seen that as much in the independent movement. Maybe that's going to be shifting over time. I don't know, but we're trying to find some really good ways of measuring what success is. And I think that is a really interesting discussion to have for all of you as well. What defines success for your clients? Yes?
I interpret that data differently. It's not so much that women businesses are not as successful. I think the data says women businesses in terms of gross receipts are not as great as.
Right.
However, what immediately follows that are a list of reasons as to why it is more difficult for women and also minority businesses to sort of break through those growth thresholds. And I think those are some of the issues a lot of us as development corporations are trying to deal with. Everything from access to business opportunities,
Right.
Those kinds of things. So
Well, and
I
that's
think it might be a mistake just to say women are satisfied. I think it's a component.
Oh, no, I'm not saying they're satisfied. I'm saying that we need to understand what goals people have in order to understand whether they've reached their goals. To your point, if someone has a growth objective and they're not meeting it, then we have to understand the constraints that they're facing and how can we help them solve them. And believe me, there are a lot of constraints out there for women, and there are a lot of constraints out there for minorities, and I don't want to discount those at all. But I also want to get away from everybody having to be a gazelle and saying that we have to have, a Google out of an organization in order to make it a successful company.
And it's important to remember that the vast majority of male-owned businesses, if you ask the owner, do you want to grow, they're going to say no. It's like 70% of male-owned businesses, they will say, no, growth's not my primary objective. And so we have to get away from growth for growth's sake being our measure of success, at least in terms of how we think about it. Yes, ma'am.
So, as a advocate for a million women business owners, I just want to say that the message that women care about lifestyle is more than anything else, or that's why they don't grow, is a really hard message, I think, for me to swallow.
Well, it wasn't more than anything else. It's again,
Okay,
yeah, I'm sorry, I misrepresented that.
He just said that men, when they're asked if they want to grow, say...
No, the vast majority of small business owners say no.
But I often see in interpretation of data, when they ask women, then they say, oh, it's because of the lifestyle thing. That's a really hard message.
I agree with
for
that.
us.
I
So I'm
completely agree with
just
that.
sharing.
Yeah. What I want to do is find how can we measure success? How can we
Yes.
measure success for women in whatever terms they set out as their goals?
And the federal agencies say revenue and number of employees.
Exactly.
And those aren't the way the people measure success. That's what we're trying to point out. Not that one's good or bad, but there's a mismatch between how small business owners measure success and how our government measures the success of small businesses. And they're not incongruents at all. And so we think that's wrong. We think
Right.
the way to measure success is in the eyes of the person creating the success, not from an outside perspective.
And maybe what you need to do is reframe it to the economic argument, which was there were three types of business owners. One was the profit maximizer, the other was the volume maximizer, and the third was the satisficer. And when you said lifestyle, I thought better to say satisficer. Because
Mhm.
there are a lot of male-owned businesses out there that find their sweet spot, and that they're satisficing. They could get bigger, they could be more profitable, but they're happy right where they are. And I think by neutralizing it with that language,
Yeah, that's
an
useful.
economic language. And I mean, personally, I am a satisficer, so I get it.
Right.
And I think in terms of companies, that is kind of where you got the guy that wants the biggest footprint, you have the guy that wants to have the yacht, and then you have the guy that just wants to have enough time with his family or her family and do whatever. And it seems like those are kind of the pots people tend to fall in when I've dealt with businesses. They're kind of in one of the three.
Yeah, the thing to remember, though, particularly when we're talking about independent businesses, very, very few of them want to grow. So you talk about small businesses in general, which includes employer businesses, very few of them want to grow. You talk about people starting independent businesses, in terms of large growth, it's tiny. And so the only thing to remember in this is not a lot of small businesses want to be the next Google. And we tend in the media and we tend in the government to way overstate how many small businesses want to grow and how much in general they want to grow. And this group wants to grow less than the average small business. So that's all.
Right.
I don't want to get too bogged down in it.
Right. Okay. Well, there was one, going back to this one, just to finish up. This is a year-over-year data point, and it's really interesting to see how much the satisfaction actually increased over just a year. And obviously it was, economic difficulties through there. I think people were really happy to be thriving in what they had set up as their own business. But the other thing we're seeing is that you get, as you get a growth in the independent workforce, You get the fringe adopters who are kind of the early adopters and take this on, and they're very passion driven because you're kind of swimming upstream a bit. You're doing something very different from what other people do. And we're really going to follow this number over time, because as you move more to the edge and then the core of getting lots of different adopters, you have a much more complex set of drivers that are causing people to be independents. And a lot of them might be that it's the best choice, but it's not necessarily a passion-driven choice. And so we're looking, over the next 5 years, this number will be very, very interesting to follow. Okay. Okay, so we have myth number 2, which is that independent work doesn't really create employment. And independent work is really becoming one of America's key job engines. And we're preaching to the choir here, you all know that. But we do have some really interesting information. If you look through, we've got people building larger businesses. And we were talking about not a whole lot of people do want to do that, but we have more than 1 in 10 want to launch a bigger business out of their independent work here. And that's 10%. That's a good chunk of potential growth there. We have 75% that say that they want to stay the course in independence or expand. So if we're looking at the people that want to stay independent or build a larger business, that is a pretty strong commitment to an independent workforce. And that means that these people have some viable economic path that they consider to work for them or their families. Independents hire other people. We have a very small, it's just the 2 of us. We work with over 150 different consultants on our research, but we don't have a single employee. And so we have relationships with those people. We pull them in on our research as we need their expertise. They tap into our expertise when they need us. And we have this wonderful umbrella of talent that we can tap into. Many of the people we work with do the same thing. And so you're just finding that independents are not just stopping the economic game at their door. It really does expand and link to more. In our survey, excuse me, Claudia.
Would you call that growth of your business, of Emergent, because you've increased the number of contractors? Or would you say that you're satisfied with the 2 of you and I'm trying to I think we got to get back to that growth issue.
It's a tough question.
It really has tarred the ability of our sector to get funding and to be appreciated for what we do. We are seen as not contributing to the GDP.
Right. 2 things. In the most recent survey that we're fielding right now, we're asking a bunch of questions on that to try to get a better sense of economic growth. And the impact on the economy of this group. This group does generate about $1 trillion in revenue when you add it all up. So there's a lot of economic activity going on. I think the second thing, when you ask us and other people like us, we believe that the network model is just much more efficient and simpler, and it is also a lifestyle choice. Having employees is a pain. If you don't have to have them, why have them? And in our case, it is a lifestyle choice. But I'm thinking about the project that we're working on right now. We have a client, we're the project leaders, our team. We've hired a research firm to help us. They have 20 employees. They've hired a panel firm to help them. They have 1,000 employees. The panel firm has hired sub-panel firms to help them. If you look at the value chain, the network involved, there's 6 or 7 firms involved in a project that 10 years ago, there would have been 2 firms involved. There would have been the client and a research firm. So the nature of work is shifting towards networks. It's shifting towards modular activities. And as part of that, individual companies don't need to employ people like they used to. And so you look at the average size of a small business over the last 2 decades, and it's fallen. It's fallen from about 21 employees to about 17. The average size of a startup's gone from about 7 or 8 employees down to about 4. And some people are interpreting that data as saying we're not as entrepreneurial as we used to be. I'm interpreting that data because I live it. I interview people all the time. Is we're outsourcing, we're automating, and we're using other independent workers and other firms to help us. And to me, it's an industrial shift, and it's a more efficient way to run our business. We are much more flexible and we're much more agile. We can be studying the independent worker today. We can study healthcare tomorrow. If we had employees that were specialists, we couldn't do that. Instead, if we have to study healthcare tomorrow, we go round up 4 healthcare experts. Bang, we're there. Flexibility and agility is what's driving this much more than anything else. And yeah, we definitely have an impact on the economy. We pay bills. We pay bills to other people who employ people.
So your growth is in gross revenues, but your so-called employee growth is not shown.
Right, and we scale up or down depending upon our interests and how much we want to work, right? Which I think is something that gets back to the satisfying, versus just focused on a growth business. Growth businesses you sustain and then you grow some more. And I think we're having a problem a little bit with semantics in here. When we talk about growth businesses, we're used to talking to big corporations, and so you get that definition of a Google or a Facebook or a very high growth, typically high tech, the Gazelle type of format. When we're talking about growth businesses for a lot of Cameo things, growth is really healthy. I mean, they're creating some stability, and they're creating, community, and the community tends to reinforce the success of their business as well. So we're not opposed to growth at all, but there are different definitions of what growth is.
And we should have more data on this in the next couple of months. Yes, ma'am.
I had 2 questions on that 12% figure.
Sure.
Because it's interesting, at least, anecdotally, it's like left-handed is 10% of the population. And we've often talked about entrepreneurs, people starting businesses and sustaining businesses tend to be about 10% of the population. We're talking kind of about employees and businesses. In that 12%, when they say growth, is your sense that they're going to grow and create jobs, create employment? Is that what they're defining as growth? Because then that statistic would seem to indicate that even within this universe of independent workers, we're still finding that kind of somewhere around 10% small business gene showing up, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, that's what we found fascinating as well. And I think it's difficult to say exactly how they'll grow. But I do think if somebody is focused on a growth business, they are strategically building the business, whether it's through a continued dependence on outsourcing or what, but your scale is changing. And that's what I would say.
I just want to interrupt for a second and introduce Barbara Vorzak, who's the governor's small business advocate and the director of the governor's office of small business.
Oh.
And so she's asking really good questions for good reasons, and she's been a wonderful supporter of Cameo too. So thank you, Bea.
Well, I like your terminology, and it is true that it's striking how we were caught by the same thing when we got this data out.
Well, and I'm thinking, I know Claudia is concerned about, the self-employment, what's going to happen in that, but I think it's really, what you're doing is really important, and that it's really still verifying there's going to always be employees, firms that have employees, but we are also seeing a trend in this need to be flexible and nubile in the way we operate as independent workers, and that new formation is a really fascinating formation. And so the whole idea of how do we define growth is going to change.
Exactly.
So that's what I find, but I still think the 10% thing is really fascinating. And it's showing up here too.
Thanks.
Claudia?
Sure.
So I do think it's really interesting and important to talk about how we define growth, but I also think that there's another area of growth besides looking at the individual business, and that's growth in the impact on the economy. And I think that's really important in talking about what's happening with independent workers or micro-entrepreneurs, is that even if they don't want to grow their business, they may be growing their impact on the economy as a group because they're getting bigger. But also, like you said, you are working with so many subcontractors, and that might not be growth for your business, but for the economy, it has a tremendous
It's striking,
impact.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we should be measuring that as well.
Right, and there are a lot of ancillary, community impacts that happen from independent workers that we see. In our community, we have a lot of people who work independently, and it's fascinating because there is a little bit more flexibility for volunteering, so the volunteerism goes up, the schools get more support. I mean, there's lots of things that come from it that we haven't been able to measure yet, but we have a lot of stories about, and that's something we'd like to do in the long term. We're just not there. One thing at a time.
We talked about the what's his first name? Shay. from Zappo, Tony Shea,
Uh-huh.
and the measure of return on community, ROC.
Right.
So let's keep that in mind as we're talking here, because we are coming up with ways of measuring ROC.
Right. Right. Good. Uh-huh.
If I may, it seems to me that I don't know how many of us have heard about or read Reid Hoffman and Ben Kesnoch's book, The Startup of You, which essentially talks about an entrepreneurial orientation, a way of looking at the world that says what we call a job is really nothing more than an organization seeking to meet its needs by and through the efforts of other people. And so that individual, what they call a job, is really them creating value based on translating what they know how to do for
Bingo.
benefit for an organization. So along this trend of independent workers planning to stay independent, whether, in my opinion, I'm on the wagon with Ben and Ben Kesnocha and Reid Hoffman with the idea this is part of our kind of charge, regardless of whether we're working with a business owner, client, or even in our interactions with other economic development people and partners, is to really support and promote this idea, this notion of value. And as value gets created, and I don't mean like a buzzword or squishy or anything like that. I'm talking about qualitative, quantitative, no kidding, on the other end of the interaction, that person's experience of life is somehow improved, and there's some metrics around that, then it seems to me that it will continue to match the statistics that you're showing, and that's part of how we can tap into some of that return on community. Because even though you may be, not creating payroll, if that impact is expanding and dollars are being circulated more, then that is something that I think has to be part of this conversation and part of how we engage decision makers around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. They just had an article in the Harvard Business Review. I don't know if you've got a chance to see it. It's a follow-up to their book. And their book focused more on being an entrepreneurial within a corporation. Interestingly enough, their Harvard Business Review article was just a couple weeks ago. Focuses more on being independent. They have a little shift in their mindset about what they're talking about, and it's been based on feedback they've gotten on their book. The book's excellent. The Harvard Business Review article's also excellent. There's also been a recent academic study out of the UK that showed that the self-employed are not only happier in their and more satisfied in their job, but they're also happier and more satisfied with their lives. It's kind of they're taking a unique approach and interesting approach to measure that, and you can agree or disagree with the methodology, but there are starting to be studies coming out that do a much better job at getting at the non-economic measures of success and happiness. I agree.
Well, and I think one of the interesting numbers up here, I mean, if you look at people, their commitment to the independent path, they clearly see value for themselves because they're not jumping ship. And we'll see, there are certain segments that are considering that, but overall, that's not what we're seeing. And so, if we're looking at, who's the best person to determine value from an economic, is it an economic viable model? It would be these people that are actually doing the work. So, okay. All right. So we've got myth number 3. That independents struggle to make a living. So we're kind of circling back around here. And the truth is that there are some independents that are really, really successful, but independence overall seems to provide a pretty clear path to middle class and higher. And so we see that the household income we've got 40% are reporting at least 75 to 100% of their household income is coming from their independent work. So they're supporting families off of this. This isn't just hobby revenue coming in. 57% report at least 50% of the household income is generated from their independent work. The numbers that you see over here on the gross median income, it really reflects pretty closely to the U.S. averages. We've got U.S. income at $50,000 for household and $35K for per capita. So, depending upon which cohort we're looking at, people are doing a lot better or as well. Mm-hmm. Oh, just one more thing with that slide, that you see quite a shift here in the different generational things. Gen Y is the millennials, so those are the 21 to 32 in this particular study. Gen X is 33 to 48, and boomers are 49 to 66. And then matures we have is the 67 plus. And you see a pretty consistent increase with age and experience. And so there's a strong measure of experience in there, I think. Matures go down slightly because they are not committed to working full time. So, and I'll cover that in a little bit. The average, for everyone overall, the average experience is 10 years as an independent in this study. So these, there's a really strong commitment to it.
I need to ask you,
sure.
Carolyn. Yesterday in the Chronicle, Andrew Ross quoted the Census Bureau's, yes, self-employment is on the rise, but the amount of money, the average, was under $50,000 a year. So it was really low income. So could you help us just say right now how you respond to that? Because people, that's often the self-employment, they don't make money.
Okay. Well, these people, we are talking about people who are working at least half-time. And so that might be one difference in in his data versus ours. Would that be
the self-employment data includes anybody that
works 1 hour.
You have to work 1 hour the prior week to be included in the BLS numbers of being employed. So, and you got a large percentage of the people there that are working 5 to 10 hours a week. And so you can't compare their median numbers or their average numbers. You have to get in under the hood and grade it by the amount of time they work. And if you actually go in and look at the people who are in their data that are self-employed working more than half time, you'll find that their numbers don't look dissimilar to these numbers. They'll be lower than these numbers because this includes some other folks, but similar. Down the back.
Question.
On your graph, when you talk about most independent workers earn a significant income, I think what would be interesting is if you were to compare income along these same age groups outside of being independent workers, just people in the labor force period. I think there would be similarities. In other words, it's not unusual to find that people in a younger age group make less money.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. No, we find it actually. I mean, it's a pretty good parallel. I think it somewhat reflects the economy overall. But what we were pleased about with the data is that it's not a lot lower because, as Claudia mentioned, everybody's pointing fingers and saying you can't live off of this, that it's not viable, and that's just not what we're seeing.
And
So,
I was thinking that Claudia asked the question, although your response is you're talking apples and oranges in
right.
terms of the definition, but I'm thinking that maybe age sort of factor there that contributes to that correlation to the income.
Absolutely. Yeah, we could look at that for you. Absolutely. Yeah, okay. All right, so myth number 4, we are talking about, and I don't have a slide on this, but it's back to the contribution to the economy question that Claudia brought up before. We have $1 trillion in 2012. We estimated close to $1 trillion in contributions from this segment to the U.S. economy. 2.2 million independents made over $100,000 last year. 96% of those were very satisfied, obviously. 75% chose independence, and 77% plan on staying independent. 10% of those people were business builders. So again, there's a really good, solid chunk in there that we would consider very successful in the economy.
What was that percent again?
2.2 million make over $100,000. Out of the 17 million, exactly. Okay, so now we're going to get into the question that someone brought up a little earlier about, is this just kids and seniors that are taking the independent path? And we get that all the time. It's either a bunch of tech geeks or it's just the kids who don't have any responsibility. And what we found is that independence really is across the board. But the experience does differ by cohort. So I'm going to walk you through each of the cohorts briefly and show you what we found from the data last year. This coming year, we are looking at this question again with a little more detail. We're going to try and do some gender analysis by cohort so that we can understand how this changes for men and for women. So Gen Y, these are the millennials. These are our kids. A lot of you probably have experienced it as colleagues or kids or neighbors. This group is really interesting because they're about 21% of the independents. They really see the independent path as economic viability. So we've looked at the information and it varied quite a bit, and so we broke it down into two. We looked at the younger Gen Ys and the older Gen Ys because obviously the older ones had some experience to bring to the table. Older Gen Y, if we're looking at that from 28 to 32, they're thriving. They're doing really well. They have some experience. They tended to have some work experience when they first came out of college. They landed into a solid economy. And they developed a professional network that they can hop out of and tap into for their work projects. The younger ones are really struggling. 40%, let's see, oh, I'm sorry, only 40% of those chose the independent path completely. The others felt forced into it for economic reasons. One of the biggest issues they have is the industry expertise is expected when you get out of college now or get out of high school. You're supposed to bring something to the table, and all of the training programs that boomers enjoyed when they got out of school are just not there anymore for people. So businesses are expecting everyone to bring expertise with them. Colleges aren't training anyone with that expertise, and Gen Y is stuck. They're trying to figure out, how do we survive in a tryout economy? Everybody wants them to work as an intern and show that they can actually bring something to the table before they're paid. So this group, and the other thing that we found really interesting with them is that Gen Yers, you just think they're the masters of networking, right? They grew up on Facebook, but they have not figured out how to translate social networking into professional networking. And that's something that Steve and I work with quite a bit in our spare time, doing some volunteer work and trying to get them to understand the difference between Facebook and LinkedIn. And it's just a very different mindset for them. They don't understand that proactive nature of really trying to put yourself out there and having some value statements that you can communicate to the workforce. So those are things that they could really use help with, and I think will create a much better success statement for them. Less than half of the Gen Yers are planning on staying independent, the young ones. Just again, they feel like they need to get into into some kind of job to get some better experience to bring to the table. Okay, next one. Gen X. We call these the deliberate independents. Gen X, grew up, they came into a workforce from school and had a pretty easy time getting a job overall. They've had, they learned technology as kids. They are very comfortable with networking, and they've got experience to bring to the table. So they are the first generation that really expected on my terms out of employment. They were upset at their parents for, saying that work is everything and making too many work sacrifices, and so they have been very, very focused on my terms. They like independence for the flexibility and for the ability to protect their private lives from the demands of work. So it doesn't mean that they're slackers at all. They work very, very hard, but they want to be able to separate the two experiences. They have quite a bit of creativity in this crowd. We've seen them, they're in very creative fields, and creativity overall trumps dollars in terms of values from the research that we've done. They're really strong economic realists. They see their industries using independence more, and so they hop onto the independent bandwagon so that they're well positioned to get some of that work. So it's not a real big emotional thing for them. It's just that that's the way things are moving. Very high success rate at independence. Okay, boomers have a mix of different experiences. I'd say that they're shifting their expectations from the no-risk world of traditional corporate social contract with your employer to the know my risk of the independent or the current workforce. So they're they understand now that you have to map out your risk management on your own, and it's just been a really big learning experience for them. More and more, the boomers are seeing independence as a less risky path, as Steve mentioned before. It's easier to have a portfolio of clients where if one client drops you or fires you, you have somebody else that will keep paying the bills. So they like spreading that risk around. They're not counting on many benefits anymore from companies, and so having to pay for those outside of the workforce is not as painful as, well, it's just on a relative scale. It's not as risky as it used to be. Very tired of politics. They still need money. They just don't have the savings in place to retire, but they are looking at sort of an ongoing commitment to working a lot longer, but they would like to do it in a passion business or social business or something that has a little bit more meaning. They're very driven by meaning. So, so they want to be active and challenged and valued.
One of the most interesting things about the data is the older boomers and the younger Gen Y, the data looks very similar. They both got whacked during the recession. The older boomers lost their jobs and didn't have good alternatives. The younger Gen Yers have had a hard time coming into it. And if you actually look at the data alone without any labels, it's hard to tell them apart. Which we were really, you sort of think about the difference in age group, say that the older boomers 58 to 65 versus the 21 to 26-year-old age groups answer a lot of these questions the same way. Really interesting for us as researchers, probably less so in the field.
Well, anecdotally, we don't have enough data to dig into this, but anecdotally, we've seen a lot of Gen Yers and boomer parents team up to form small businesses and micro businesses, because the Gen Yers have all the technical expertise for setting something up, and the boomer parents have a lot of the business experience, and there's some very successful businesses coming out of that. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Are there different needs for the two different cohorts? Like they might, right? They're all starting. Are there different needs? I know you mentioned
in terms of succeeding at independence, absolutely. I mean, for Gen Y, I'd say that the help with networking and getting some basic skills that you're bringing to the table, basic business skills. If they could all become Microsoft competent, so that they could go in and use spreadsheets, it would help them out tremendously. And we keep talking about the service side, but you can create widgets and have them manufactured somewhere else and still be a solopreneur or an independent worker. And so and a lot of Gen Yers have those wonderful ideas, but they need help when, how do we create that idea? How do we bring that to fruition? So so that's for Gen Y. X, as I said, they're just not having too many problems. I mean, they've got I would say that, for anybody, networking is the biggest issue, particularly if you've been out of the workforce at all. If women have been staying at home and decide to re-enter, they might need help reconnecting and figuring out, the overall network and some basic technology skills. Boomers, same thing for them. A lot of helping them understand what Twitter is always, how do we get the market? How do we reach the market? Because they're thinking about, okay, I've got to get a yellow page ad, or I've got to put flyers out on the product that I'm doing or the service that I'm offering. And how can we teach them that the world has shifted to findability, that your clients will find you, but you have to lay the right tracks for them to find you. And so those are some really basic things that are not expensive to do, but they are critical in survival. So, and word of mouth for the service industry. How do you help people with word of mouth and getting a reputation developed? That's LinkedIn helps tremendously with that. Reputation management's huge. So, any other questions? Oh, no, okay. Let's see. Matures. Matures are they're a fun group because they really embrace independence, and it's because they don't have any other options. They don't say that, but nobody's looking to hire the 67-year-olds and up. This group actually has a very high level of education, and what happens, I think, is that we see a strong sense of engagement. These people don't want to stop working. They like work. They like being engaged. It makes them feel young. They also like having some money out of it. 24% actually need to work. 38% just want to work past retirement because they enjoy it. So there's a mix of needs there, and you're probably dealing with people that are, that do need to work. Women in this group are definitely underserved, and they are struggling because they have not had the same network opportunity through their career. Their career is just, if you're 67 years old, you haven't had quite the breadth of career necessarily as a lot of the younger women have. And so for them, really understanding how to get connected in and bring a service to the marketplace or a product to the marketplace is very important. But they have really high level of satisfaction. It's considered a lifestyle choice for them. And interestingly enough, the mature independents self-describe as business owners more than anyone else, even though they're not business builders. But that's, it might be their generation or whatever, but they see themselves as having their own business. And, Gen Xers, on the other hand, really see themselves as a contractor and a portfolio manager. They don't see careers anymore as a career. They see it as a portfolio of projects. And so how they think about careers are very different. Okay. Any questions? Okay. You want to, women. Now we started talking about women a little bit before. With independents, it's really interesting because we see about half of all independents are women. And that is across the board. There are more independents, increasingly a larger percentage of independents as we move into the younger group. So you see 58% of millennials, 52% of Gen X, 44% of boomers, 31% of matures. Very strong correlation to education levels for those particular groups. And so we've got greater confidence, greater skills brought to the marketplace, and probably better networking as well. Women are, I think this number, the 50%, is really interesting because it's so different from small businesses. And so I think that's an area where we really want to understand what is the difference in definition and that notion of growth or what you're committing to do. This gives people a lot of autonomy. People say, I can be my own person and I don't have to answer to anyone else, and I can be flexible about my life and do the things I want to get done. So we thought originally when we were doing our research that we would see a lot of mothers doing independent work because they'd be looking for the flexibility, and there's actually a much lower percentage of children of mothers in the independent workforce than of the workforce overall. So women are worried about benefits more than men. But they're much more confident about managing business details. And I think that's interesting for you all, that they don't see that that's a big worry. It's only 21% reported managing business details as a worry. For men, it was a third. And, but benefits and that security issue come up much more for women.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
Did you note the marital status?
We do have marital status.
Because I would suspect that, divorce, probably a higher issue around, things like benefits, employment in that situation would be important, particularly if, say, if they have kids.
We're hoping to look at that more this year. We have a bigger data set, and we were starting to lose the statistical significance by breaking it down into so many different levels. So we're hoping to get more of that granularity where we can really look at how divorced women versus married women versus singles are behaving in these things.
You probably have to look at partners at that point.
Right, we have a category for that. Yeah, we tried to cover everything. Yes.
Speaking of which, and I apologize, I may have missed it. What was your sample size?
The sample size for the overall survey was 1,100, I believe, for the national, for both are national, for the sizing survey, and then we had for 750 for the attitudinal survey. And this year we've done 2,000 for the national survey to do a sizing of market, and then we are shifted to almost 2,000 for the attitudinal survey. So we're going to have a lot more depth to go with, which is great. Okay. Traditional women are, they don't want to return to traditional employment, but they are more willing to consider that as an option than men are. So for the statement won't return to traditional employment, 54% of the men report that, 42% of the women. So again, it's about half, but slightly different sides of the equation. Okay?
So we've painted a really positive picture of independent work, and the reality is it is positive for many, but unfortunately there are a lot of people that it's not for, and there's a fair amount of people that aren't happy with it. And we've been doing this for a decade now, and so we have an anecdotal assessment of happiness that I have to say is based in part on statistics, but also our view of what we're hearing in our interviews. And we consistently kind of hear, it's interesting, about 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said it really is a third, a third, a third. A third of the people really like it. A third of the people are like, nah, could go back to a job, stay this. A third of the people say, I dislike it. We've seen a shift to where people are happier, and I think the recession had a fair amount to do with that. But I also think traditional changes in traditional work has had an impact. And so our kind of assessment today is about half the people are happy being independent and very happy with it. About a quarter of the people say, oh, I could go either way. And about a quarter of the people are telling us, no, I'm really not happy and I'd like to get a traditional job. And an important thing to point out in surveys like this and in research like this, underrepresented groups are underrepresented. And so if you're a minority, if you're low income, in particular if you're an immigrant, you're less likely to get caught in research like this. And it's not just ours, this is a problem across the board. About the only people who don't have that problem is the Census Department and the government agencies. So anytime you're reading traditional third-party research of survey research in particular, keep in mind that those, and I think you as an audience understand this better than most audiences we present in front of. Most audiences we present in front of don't quite get that. But so these numbers even here probably overstate it, because we're not catching a lot of people that are in abusive positions in the independent workforce. And there are abusive positions, particularly in construction, in the general hospitality industry. So I just wanted to say that, and our drivers that we've consistently found around where people are happy with it, it is around choice, it is around their definition of success, and it's around their confidence in their skills. And the challenges are pretty straightforward out there. It's hard to make money. I mean, and a lack of predictable income is even often a bigger problem than it's hard to make money. We had an interesting example of some relatives that are independent workers, and I can't remember, they made $500,000 one year, but then the next year they made none. And they reinvested all that money back into their business, and so the third year they made a little bit, and then they had another hit. And so it's not just a lack of income, it's the lack of predictable income, and we hear that very consistently from people. It's very hard to plan. Benefits is always an issue. There's a raging debate going on around, will Obamacare be better for this group or worse, or in general. We believe Obamacare is a real plus for this group, because it will make, in many states, health insurance for individuals simply isn't available, or it's extremely hard to get. California, it's relatively easy to get here, but it's expensive, and so we're hoping that it'll turn out to be a plus for us. But benefits continue to be a problem. And then, of course, just sort of traditional planning for retirement. So there's a lot of challenges to this. And what we see in terms of the success factors, as I mentioned, choosing independence, we also find that if people view themselves or talk about, yeah, I'm a business owner in our interviews, or they use the word entrepreneurship, if they use words like that, it means that they're focused on their business and they're more likely to be successful. We've done research in a number of fields. We had a lot of fun doing research with artists, commercial artists, traditional artists, to figure out who was successful from a financial standpoint. And it was very consistently was the artists that told us that they were spending a third to half of their time on their business and about half of their time on their art. And those people actually also were the ones that were being viewed as artistically successful. And so across the board when we do this, sort of viewing yourself as a business owner, spending the time running the business, and having the ability to do that and the skills to do that really indicates success levels. More and more, it's a strong network, confidence in skills and abilities, and then, of course, you've got to be able to deal with the ambiguity of being and the lack of security. It's a psychological barrier. And so when we look at this, we think organizations like yours, bringing skills, bringing training, bringing expertise is a huge help. You'll see we didn't put money up here. When we're talking about independent businesses, because they are solopreneurs and they're very small businesses, financing doesn't tend in the national survey to come up as a very important item. They tend to be started with relatively small amounts of money, $5,000 to $15,000, and their ongoing expenses tend to be relatively low. 50 to 60% of these people are working out of their homes, so their overall expense levels aren't high either. So we don't see financing on this list. When you got into the micro businesses and the people that start at, or product businesses, that's when money starts to become important. The majority of these folks are services businesses as opposed to product businesses. So if we cut this into the product business group, money would be, and financing would be on the list. So those are the things that that are important on it. Our studies we did this with our partner, MBO Partners. It's a company that provides infrastructure services to independent workers, but the information, the larger reports and data are there. So with that, we're done with our prepared remarks.